I always like to think of libertarians not as the wacky fringe, but as the moderate, the unrecognized moderate middle, that we are actually consistently finding ourselves a place between the extremes of left and right.
You guys have produced this awesome issue, Burn After Reading, which, by the way, is named after one of my favorite movies as well. For people watching this, can you give us just a quick rundown of Reason Magazine, your history with it, and what it's all about?
Absolutely. So Reason Magazine is the magazine of free minds and free markets. We are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. So founded in 1968 by some guy in his mother's basement, exactly as you would imagine. And one of the things that we're trying to do in this issue, but we really do in all of our issues, is to talk about where the boundaries are between legal and illegal, or permissible and impermissible, why they are where they are, and whether they're in the right place. So this issue in particular is our attempt to explicitly hang out at and experiment on those lines of legality.
Is it possible that some of these lines aren't based on good public policy, but maybe politics?
It's possible. You're quite right. Yes. So one thing that we really looked at in this issue was, we had the goal of trying to hit behaviors that weren't just things that would be troublesome to people on the left or things that people on the right might object to, but to really look across the spectrum. So we have a tutorial on how to hire an escort written by a full-time sex worker, Maggie McNeil, who also writes for us in other capacities. We also have a tutorial about how to build a handgun at home using parts you order on the internet and household tools. So the idea was to kind of move back and forth across the spectrum. One actually piece that's particularly interesting about this issue is that the how to hire an escort piece was written in a totally different legal landscape than the one in which it was ultimately published, because all of the laws, at least the federal laws around the promotion of prostitution and the facilitation of prostitution by online platforms changed. We actually had to send the piece back for a rewrite. So it's a great example of how none of the risks changed to either Johns or prostitutes, none of the underlying legal theory changed, and yet because of our current politics about sex and money at the moment, we had to redo the entire piece.
So by mentioning those two issues, you just did the classic libertarian thing, which is to trigger and alienate everybody on the left and the right, because I think most of the people on the left are with you about sex workers, and everybody on the right is probably with you about the Second Amendment and the freedom of guns. Why do libertarians always do this to people?
Because it has to be done. I think this is something that Reason Magazine has done all along. We have this idea that we're not beholden to either party. We are not on Team Red or Team Blue, and that sort of puts us in a unique position to be straight about issues that people are talking in circles around so that they can support their guy for office. And, in particular, free speech right now is such a hot issue. It's something that used to really belong to the left in a lot of ways, right? A lot of Reason writers are card-carrying members of the ACLU and have been for decades, and they see the ACLU's defense of free speech as, something that's part and parcel with the civil libertarian mission. The ACLU is going perhaps a little squishy on this question these days. The right wants to step up and say, now free speech is our issue. We want conservatives on college campuses to say whatever they want. We want political correctness not to take over. But of course, at the same time, the right would, and particularly Donald Trump in this particular example, would cheerfully deport a football player for not standing up for the national anthem. Or for burning a flag, I guess is what he actually suggested deportation
Or Samantha Bee might be on that boat as well.
Samantha Bee might be on that boat as well. So revoke broadcast licenses, more realistically. That's a sort of continual threat from the right. So, I think libertarians, I always like to think of libertarians not as the wacky fringe, but as the unrecognized moderate middle, that we are actually consistently finding ourselves a place between the extremes of left and right, that unfortunately we seem to be having trouble selling to the vast majority of the American public.
I do think there is that middle, particularly amongst young people. They're registering as independents, and your colleagues have written about this exhaustively. And part of what's happening is the so-called left and the right on both sides is becoming more extreme and more tribal, and really their tribe is not defined by what they believe, but by who they hate. And I'm not so confident that either the left or the right supports free speech anymore. And I think it's very selectively enforced, again, based on that tribal mentality. If Samantha Bee says it, it is intolerable on the right. If Roseanne Barr says it, it's intolerable on the left. And that seems to go on every day.
And that was the exercise in this issue. As I say in my editor's note at the front of the issue, this is explicitly about how the First Amendment shores up and protects all of your other rights. I mean, this idea that that the rights exist in a vacuum is I think too often trafficked for political purposes. And our goal was to kind of whichever side of the aisle you're on, to bring you in and say like, oh, well, you love the Second Amendment, right? Here's your Second Amendment protections, and then say it's the exact same principle. It is precisely the same thing that should that should make you think twice before you say we need to have a totally transparent communication system, say, with backdoors for the feds so that we can catch the terrorists, right? Maybe that's not the right way of thinking about it, even if that's your natural inclination. And of course, with the war on drugs, we're always writing about it from different perspectives and talking about the futility of prohibition. But at the same time, as technology changes, the ways in which prohibition is futile also change. And so we wanted to highlight both how people move their money around, how people communicate, and how people do things in the physical world, like infuse THC into some bourbon so that they can have a cannabis cocktail.
And I'm coming over to Reason at some point to try that.
We did test out quite a few of these things in the office, which is legal in DC, I hasten to add.
To be clear, everything we've done is almost legal.
Yes.
So this is the handy pullout from Reason magazine with all of these controversial articles, and I feel like you guys should probably convince Penn Jillette to carry this through airport security along with his metal Bill of Rights. But I open it up, and the first thing is about personal encryption and using things like Tor. You triggered Lindsey Graham.
Probably. I mean, well, that's a if we don't do that once a day, we consider it a bad day at Reason magazine.
And there's this, it's now acceptable for him. I mean, a lot of conservatives just despise Lindsey Graham for a lot of reasons. But when he says something like, if you didn't do anything wrong, you don't have anything to hide, the outrage doesn't seem to be there on the Republican side. What's going on?
This is something that I actually think about a lot, because everybody knows that they break laws. And this is something that, I'm sure you know Harvey Silverglate, who wrote a great book called 3 Felonies a Day, where he describes how people are, people who think of themselves as law-abiding citizens are continually violating laws, maybe laws they don't even know exist. There's another piece in the issue about purposely or accidentally violating customs laws when you come back from a trip and you have some food or some wine or some other substances in your luggage, a sort of how-to about what the best way is to avoid punishment for that. And that's something that lots of people do.
I thought that chapter was a little clickbaity, because I smuggle cured meat back from Europe all the time, and I thought you guys were going to tell me some fail-proof way to get through. And it is true. The punchline is, yeah, you might get caught, you might not.
Yeah, but I think that's still, it's still useful information to know, well, if you do get caught, how bad's it going to be?
Well, now I'm freaked out, because the laws are potentially more stringent than even I imagined.
And the answer is it's actually pretty bad. Yeah. There's a weirdly extortionary set of procedures in place, which I actually didn't know about either. That piece was actually written by an intern, so I can only assume we'll have to bail him out of jail.
Who was running cured meat across international borders.
Yeah, well, we don't pay our interns very well, so it's got to make the money somehow. But this idea that everybody is breaking some law, and it's really a question of selective enforcement. It's not a question of all the laws being just. And there are lots of reasons to want privacy that don't have anything to do with legality or illegality. Maybe you just don't want your spouse to see what you're up to. Maybe you don't want your kids to see what you're up to. Maybe you don't want your employer to see what you're up to. And maybe none of those people, it's their business. I mean, the desire for an expectation of privacy is not itself evidence of wrongdoing, and to treat it that way is to misunderstand human nature.
So let's dig into the gun issue a little bit more, because I thought it was I have no intention, at least not for now, of making my own gun. I went out and I got trained recently. It's not easy in the District of Columbia to own a handgun, but I decided after the Eagles of Death Metal shootout in Paris that I needed to take some responsibility for my family's safety. But the broader point here is that most people aren't going to acquire the parts and assemble their own weapon, but that you can. And it struck me that the primary point is people that fantasize, people on the left that fantasize about a world without guns, they're kind of ridiculous, because not only are there millions and millions of guns in the marketplace now, but you can make your own freaking gun.
Yeah, and this is something, Reason, of course, writes about gun control and gun prohibition quite a lot. We tend to focus on the guns that are already out there, this idea that America is a gun-owning nation, and that pulling those back would be such a socially catastrophic event as to be impossible. But I think we do write a lot about sort of do-it-yourself culture and how that changes people's relationship to authority, and this idea that not only is it parts you can buy on the internet, it's parts you can buy on the internet from quite a few different providers. And I think that's an important element to this story too. If you shut down one guy that's selling a lower 80 for a Glock 17, there are plenty of other people who will be happy to sell you that same part. And it's also, by the way, completely legal. And one interesting tidbit in the piece is that for non-gun items, for non-firearms that are proximate to firearms in some way, you can actually send them to the federal government and say, if I sell this, am I going to go to jail? And then once you get a sign-off from these regulators, you really do have an extra layer of protection, an extra layer of assurance about the legality of your product. And that's true for these lower 80s. They are absolutely legal. They are not guns. But at the same time, if you have a Dremel and some sandpaper and a few other basic tools, you can, and I will say, like, a certain minimum level of aptitude in these things. Like the one that we built, I'm moderately handy. I'm not sure I could have built it to the level of confidence about firing it. And actually, elsewhere in the issue, our science correspondent, Ron Bailey, uses a CRISPR kit to do some gene editing. And he admits that he was a little sloppy. So there's now some drug-resistant E. coli in Ron Bailey's kitchen, just in case he invites you to dinner. You should be aware.
When I read that one, I imagined Jesse cooking meth in his kitchen on Breaking Bad, and there's clouds of toxic smoke everywhere. In
fact, a little less dramatic than that, just some petri dishes with swabs. But yeah, so for the gun, I think, to point out that not only is the clawback of existing guns really an unrealistic proposition, but also that even despite its best efforts and common sense gun control, there are plenty of firearms out there that the government doesn't know exist. And there's no reason for their owners to share that fact with the government. And even if every known gun could be withdrawn from society, that would not be the same as a gun-free country.
It's a very sort of a let's find a unicorn kind of strategy that they have, and they're out, and I think both sides sometimes are guilty of that fantasy. The same thing with drug prohibition on the right. But I should say this. Staffers for Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer are pouring through this issue right now, drawing up model legislation to stop all of this illicit activity. So thank you for that.
Yeah, this is, of course, always the danger is when you say, hey, look here, I think I found this loophole. Someone, and that someone is always Chuck Schumer, will rush to close it.
So let's go back to, let's wrap up on this. Let's go back to something you said earlier about feeling like libertarians are in the middle. And I feel the same way. And I always thought that this left-right spectrum didn't really make much sense anyway, because if your choices are between Hitler on the right and Pol Pot on the left, it doesn't make any sense to me, because in a lot of ways they were sort of the same guy, guilty with the blood on their hands and murdering the people in their countries. Surely we don't have to split the difference between those two guys. What do libertarians think about, you know, where we belong in the political spectrum?
I mean, what I used to say actually was socially liberal and fiscally conservative. But I've found recently that phrase isn't as meaningful as it used to be. That sort of, well, does socially liberal mean you're in favor of social programs? You know, what? I think this is partially the erosion of the notion of civil liberties. This is, it's an idea that's in flux right now. So I think that's tricky. I also think it's tricky when you say fiscally conservative because, of course, people who self-describe as conservatives on the Hill are not currently acting as good stewards of taxpayer money. So
that's very understated.
yeah, I thought I was being nice there. I'm a nice gal. The idea that there's that description no longer works very well when it once did, I think is itself telling about American politics. So the thing that I say now is something more like, well, free minds and free markets, right? That we want people to have personal choice and also to have government be as small as possible and as minimally intrusive as possible, as cheap as possible. But I think because of this polarization that you're describing, because of this sort of strong sense of the increasing gap between left and right, one sort of community service that libertarians can do is help people burst their bubbles without being too threatening, right? Like if you're on the right, you should invite me over to your barbecue and we can smoke cigars and drink beer and talk about how America is probably the greatest country in the world. And then like maybe at the end of the night when we're all feeling really chummy, we can talk a little bit about how criminal justice reform might be a good idea or decriminalization of certain substances could help the country be a better place. And vice versa on the left, I'm happy to bring my purple hair over to your house and smoke a bunch of weed with you, but then maybe we could talk about like, wow, a big part of your paycheck really does seem to be going toward war. Maybe that's not a great idea. So I guess that's where I see libertarians in the current political climate is helping people get out of their bubbles, seeing a different way that's less polarized to think about politics, but is still philosophically consistent and coherent, and I think presents a vision of a world where people and goods freely move across borders and you get to live your life the way you want and not as long as you don't bother other people. That's something that appeals to more people than are currently comfortable with the label.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of this angst right now, like everyone's pissed off and everyone's fighting with each other, particularly in politics, it's because the old paradigm and the power that went with it is collapsing, and all of the incumbents, whether it be party bosses or CEOs or the head of the New York Times, they're freaking out a little bit because they hate the competition. And Donald Trump, much like Ron Paul and the Tea Party before him, this is part of a process of redefining how we solve these problems. So I feel like libertarians are uniquely positioned to offer an alternative approach that's tolerant of people that want to live a different way. And so you can have people on the left that want to live off the grid and grow weed and wear tie-dye. That's cool. Or if you want to go to church on Sunday and you want to raise your kids in a certain way and never ever wear a tie-dye shirt, that's cool too. Like these things don't have to be contradictions. And I think a politician, a really cool guy named Nick Freitas, he's running as a Republican in Virginia. The way he describes it is, whether or not you're pro-liberty depends on how comfortable you are using violence against somebody else. Because the left and the right, they like to compel people to do certain things, whether it's pay more taxes or not buy marijuana, whatever it is, it's always enforced at the end of a gun. And I thought that was an interesting way to say it.
Yeah, I also think that, at the heart of libertarianism, at least as I understand it, is a pluralism. That you don't need everybody to live like you just need them to let you live like you. I mean, this is the sort of, it's a variation of the golden rule. You don't do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Do unto others as they would do unto themselves. And that's, it's a harder place to get to. It's a bit more of a mental two-step, and applying it to politics is very tricky because politics is about power. Politics is all doing unto others. But, I think one of the goals of Reason Magazine and of this Burn After Reading issue in particular is to say, Let's talk about the things other people do that make you nervous and why you should probably still let them do them if you want to do the things that make them nervous. And that's, maybe that's not like a shining city on a hill type vision, but I do think it's something that intuitively appeals to people once they think about it in those terms.
Now, I've read that demand for this issue is skyrocketing. How do people get their hands on this beautiful ancient paper publication?
Yes. So surprisingly enough, people want their illicit activities on Dead Tree, which I admire. We actually are running a promotion right now. If you go to the site and search for Burn After Reading, search for my editor's note, just go to reason.com. We're running a little promotion where if you subscribe to the magazine, we'll drop one of this issue into first class mail for you in the next couple days. So you can get your hands on this copy and then get 11 more issues after that.
Okay, thank you, Katherine. I look forward to reading all the angry comments after we publish this.
So many angry comments. Thanks for having me on.